There is a universal, unspoken rule of the night. If someone knocks on your door after midnight, you do not open it. You might feel safe behind the wood and the deadbolts of your home, but the moment you turn that lock, you are actively inviting the darkness inside. Welcome back to Prince of Darkness. Tonight, we are exploring 4 terrifying true accounts of late-night visitors whose knocks should have been ignored. Lock your doors, turn down the lights, and whatever you do, don't answer. To give you some context, this happened about 3 years ago when I was 22. My uncle owns a property in a deeply rural part of the Pacific Northwest. It's a beautiful 2-story cabin, but it is incredibly isolated. The nearest neighbor is at least 3 miles down a winding dirt road, and the property is surrounded on all sides by dense, towering pine trees. My uncle was going on a 2-week vacation to Europe, and since I was in between semesters at college, he offered to pay me to house sit and look after his 2 golden retrievers. For the first few days, it was a dream. I spent my time reading, hiking, and enjoying the absolute silence of the woods. But by the 4th night, a massive storm rolled in. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the metal roof of the cabin so loudly that it drowned out the television. The wind was howling, causing the old timber of the house to groan and settle. It was around 2:30 a.m. I was lying on the couch in the living room downstairs, half asleep, with a horror movie playing on the TV at a low volume. The dogs were curled up on the rug next to me. Suddenly, both dogs shot up, their ears pinned back, and the fur on their spines stood straight up. They didn't bark. Instead, they let out these low, guttural growls, staring directly at the heavy wooden front door. I muted the television, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. In the dead silence of the room, cutting through the torrential rain outside, I heard it. Knock. 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 It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was 3 slow, deliberate taps. My blood ran cold. Out here, in the middle of a brutal storm at 2 in the morning, nobody just drops by. I slowly got off the couch, telling the dogs to stay quiet. I crept toward the front door. There was no peephole, but there were 2 narrow panes of frosted glass on either side of the heavy oak door. I pressed my face near the glass. All I could make out was a distorted, blurry silhouette standing on the porch. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. A woman's voice answered. She sounded young, frantic, and on the verge of tears. "Please, please, you have to help me. My car slid off the dirt road about a mile back. I hit a tree. My phone is dead and I'm freezing. Please, just let me in to use your phone." Human instinct is a powerful thing. When you hear someone crying for help, your immediate reaction is to open the door. My hand actually reached out and rested on the cold brass of the deadbolt, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fact that the dogs were still growling, refusing to approach the door. Maybe it was the isolation. "I can call a tow truck for you. Just stay on the porch out of the rain." "No, please," she sobbed, hitting the door with the flat of her hand. "I'm bleeding. I think my arm is broken. Please, just open the door for a second. I'm so cold." I felt a pang of intense guilt. What if she was really dying out there? But the survival instinct in my gut was screaming at me. I backed away from the door. "I'm calling 911 right now," I told her. "They'll be here soon." The moment I said that, the crying stopped completely. There were no more sobs, no more pleas for help. The sudden, dead silence from the other side of the door was infinitely more terrifying than the crying. I slowly backed up into the kitchen, grabbed a massive butcher knife from the block, and retreated up the stairs to the 2nd floor, taking the dogs with me. I locked myself in the master bedroom, which had a window that overlooked the front porch and the driveway. I turned off the bedroom light, keeping the room in total darkness, and carefully peered through the blinds. The porch light was on, casting a harsh yellow glow into the rain. The woman was standing there, but she wasn't clutching a broken arm. She was standing perfectly straight, holding a cell phone to her ear. And she wasn't alone. Standing just at the edge of the light, partially obscured by the tree line, were two massive men. They were dressed in dark clothes, pulling their hoods up. As I watched in absolute horror, the woman ended her call, turned to the men, and shook her head. One of the men stepped into the light. In his right hand, he was gripping a long, heavy steel crowbar. They stood there in the rain for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the front door. Then, the man with the crowbar looked up. He didn't just look at the house. His eyes scanned the second floor and locked directly onto the window I was looking out of. Even through the rain, I could feel his gaze piercing right through me. He slowly raised the crowbar, pointing it directly at my window, before the three of them turned and disappeared into the dark woods. I called the police, but because of the storm and the location, it took them nearly an hour to arrive. They found deep tire tracks hidden down a logging trail near the property, but no crashed car. The police told me it's a common tactic for home invaders in rural areas to use a crying woman to bypass locked doors. If I had turned that deadbolt, I have no doubt that those two men would have rushed the door, and I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I live in a mid-sized city, on the fourth floor of a slightly run-down apartment building. It's the kind of building where the hallways are always faintly smelling of stale smoke, the fluorescent lights constantly flicker, and you do your best to avoid making eye contact with your neighbors. The doors in this building are thick, heavy fire doors, which usually block out most of the noise from the hallway. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means my sleep schedule is completely non-existent. I often find myself wide awake at 3 or 4 in the morning editing photos or working on layouts. It was a Tuesday night, around 3:15 a.m. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the low hum of my refrigerator and the soft clicking of my mouse. I was sitting at my desk in the living room, completely absorbed in my work, wearing a pair of noise-canceling headphones. Even with the headphones on, I felt the vibration before I actually heard the sound, a heavy, thudding vibration through the floorboards. I took off my headphones and listened. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was knocking on my front door. It was a heavy, authoritative knock, not the polite tapping of a neighbor asking to borrow something. It sounded like someone hitting the door with the side of their fist. I froze. I didn't have any food on the way, I wasn't expecting anyone, and at 3:15 a.m., nobody brings good news. I stood up from my desk. The only light on in my apartment was the glow of my monitor. I tiptoed across the living room in my socks, making absolutely no noise. As I got closer to the heavy fire door, I noticed the sliver of light coming from the hallway underneath the door. The hallway lights are motion activated. If someone was out there, the light would be on. It was. But the sliver of light was broken by two dark shadows. Someone was standing inches from my door, their feet planted squarely on my welcome mat. I held my breath, leaned forward, and pressed my eye against the cold brass peephole. I expected to see a drunk neighbor at the wrong door, or maybe a police officer. Instead, I saw absolutely nothing. It was pitch black. At first, I thought the hallway light had timed out and turned off, but looking down at the crack beneath the door, the light was clearly still illuminating the hallway. I looked back through the peephole, still black. Then, my stomach dropped as the terrifying realization hit me. The peephole wasn't broken. Someone was standing on the other side of the door, holding their thumb firmly over the glass lens. They didn't want me to see who they were. I stood there, paralyzed, my face inches from the door. I could hear them breathing, a slow, heavy, wheezing breath that seeped through the cracks in the doorframe. Whoever it was, they were pressing their face right up against the wood, listening for me. Suddenly, the shadows under the door shifted. The person took a step back. I thought they were leaving, but then I heard a metallic clink. It was the sound of metal sliding against metal. I looked down at the deadbolt. The latch was slowly, agonizingly vibrating. They weren't just knocking to see if I was home. They had knocked to mask the sound of sliding a lockpick into the keyhole. Panic seized me. I didn't shout. I didn't ask who was there. I reached out, grabbed the deadbolt with both hands, and held it firmly in place to prevent the cylinder from turning. For 10 agonizing minutes, I stood there in the dark, my hands cramping as I held the lock. I could feel the metal tension tool scraping against the pins inside the lock, vibrating through the brass and into my palms. They were working methodically, quietly. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. With my hands still gripping the lock, I slammed my foot against the bottom of the door as hard as I could and screamed, "I have a gun and the police are already on the way." The picking stopped instantly. The heavy breathing ceased. I heard the distinct sound of rubber-soled shoes quickly shuffling down the hallway, making their way to the emergency stairwell. I stayed pressed against that door until the sun came up. When the building manager checked the security cameras the next day, they found that the cameras in my hallway had been spray-painted black around 2 a.m. Whoever was trying to get into my apartment had planned it perfectly. They wanted me to look through that blind peephole, unlock the door out of confusion, and walk right into whatever nightmare they had waiting for me. Last summer, I was making a cross-country drive from California to New York to move into a new apartment. I was trying to do the trip as cheaply as possible, which meant driving long hours and sleeping in budget motels just off the interstate. It was my third day on the road. I had been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, fueled entirely by black coffee and cheap gas station energy drinks. By the time I hit rural Nebraska, I was experiencing highway hypnosis. The white lines were blurring together, and I knew if I didn't pull over, I was going to crash. I took the next exit and found an old run-down motel sitting completely by itself off a deserted 2-lane highway. The neon vacancy sign was buzzing, missing half of its letters. It was exactly the kind of place you see in a horror movie, but I was too exhausted to care. I paid $40 in cash to an elderly man behind bulletproof glass and got the key to room 114. The room was exactly what you'd expect: a sagging mattress, a CRT television bolted to the dresser, and a lingering smell of bleach and old cigarettes. The door had a standard electronic keycard lock, a deadbolt, and a heavy metal chain guard. I locked the deadbolt, threw the chain across the track, collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, and instantly passed out. I was violently ripped from my sleep by a loud, aggressive pounding. I sat bolt upright in the dark. It took my brain a few seconds to remember where I was. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed 3:17 a.m. Bang! 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 The door rattled in its frame. "Front desk, we have a severe pipe leak in the room above you. We need to inspect the ceiling immediately." I rubbed my eyes, completely disoriented. A pipe leak? At 3 in the morning? It sounded plausible, but my brain was still foggy. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and walked over to the door. "Just a second," I called out, reaching for the deadbolt. As my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sudden wave of primal dread washed over me. I don't know why, but I stopped. I didn't unlock it. Instead, I carefully pulled back the edge of the heavy blackout curtain covering the window next to the door. The walkway outside was illuminated by sickly yellow bug lights. Standing outside my door was a man, but he wasn't wearing a motel uniform. He was wearing dirty jeans, a heavy winter coat, and a dark beanie pulled low over his eyes. And he was holding something in his right hand, a crowbar. My heart felt like it stopped beating. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the door, my hands trembling. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice losing any pretense of professionalism. "I said open the damn door!" I remained completely silent, retreating toward the back of the room near the bathroom. Then I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't the sound of the crowbar hitting the wood. It was the distinct electronic beep and click of the keycard reader. Click! The handle turned. The heavy door swung inward. The man had a master keycard. The door opened about 3 inches before it hit the metal chain lock with a violent metallic clang. The chain pulled taut, holding the door shut. Through the narrow gap, I could see the man's face. He shoved his shoulder against the door, trying to break the chain from the wall. The screws groaned, but the metal held. He stopped pushing. Through the 3-inch gap, he tilted his head and peered into the dark room. He saw me standing near the bathroom, gripping my heavy metal flashlight like a club. The man didn't look angry that the chain had stopped him. Instead, a slow, wide smile spread across his face, revealing a set of rotting teeth. "Lucky boy," he whispered. He pulled the door shut, locking it behind him, and casually walked away down the concrete walkway. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with my flashlight, staring at the door until the sun came up. When I finally left the room and went to the front desk, the elderly man I had checked in with was gone. The office was completely empty, and the front door was wide open. I didn't wait around to find out what was going on. I got in my car and drove until I was 3 states away. I am a college student, and during the winter break of my sophomore year, I went back to live at my parents' house in the suburbs. My parents are both doctors who frequently work overnight shifts at the hospital, leaving me alone in our large 2-story house for days at a time. I actually preferred it. I'm a Naulau, and I loved the solitude of having the whole house to myself. Our house sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It has a large front yard, and the backyard is bordered by a tall wooden fence that backs up to a dense patch of community woods. The first floor of the house is almost entirely open concept, with massive floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room and a large sliding glass door in the kitchen that leads out to the back patio. It was a Thursday night. The clock on my laptop read 2:45 a.m. I was sitting at the kitchen island, studying for an upcoming certification exam, with my noise-canceling headphones resting around my neck. The house was completely silent. Then, a sharp, distinct noise echoed from the front of the house. Knock, knock. I froze, my pen hovering over my notebook. It was the front door, at nearly 3 a.m. I immediately turned off the kitchen island lights, plunging the entire first floor into darkness. I crept into the foyer and peeked through the narrow window next to the front door. The porch light was off. I couldn't see anything but the dark shapes of the bushes in our front yard. There was no car in the driveway and no movement on the street. I assumed it was some teenagers playing a prank. I let out a long breath, turned around, and started walking back to the kitchen. As I crossed the living room, a second set of knocks echoed through the house. Knock, knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the side of the house. Someone had walked around to the window of my father's study. My stomach tied itself into a knot. This wasn't a prank. Someone was doing a perimeter check. They were walking around the house, knocking on the glass, testing to see if anyone was home or awake to respond. If nobody answered, they would assume the house was empty and look for a way in. I crouched down behind the living room sofa, keeping my profile as low as possible. The moonlight was streaming through the large windows, casting long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor. 2 minutes passed in agonizing silence. I prayed they had given up and walked away. Then, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Knock, knock. It came from the kitchen, directly behind me. I slowly turned my head and looked over the top of the sofa toward the back of the house. Standing on our back patio, perfectly framed by the large sliding glass door, was the towering silhouette of a man. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up so far it completely obscured his face. He was standing completely motionless, staring into the dark kitchen. I didn't move a muscle. I barely breathed. He was separated from me by less than 20 feet and a pane of quarter-inch glass. I watched as he slowly raised his hand and pressed it flat against the sliding glass door, leaning his weight against the frame. He knew the lock was locked. I had checked it hours ago. But the sheer terror of watching this massive stranger calmly test the structural integrity of my home paralyzed me. Then, he did something that still gives me nightmares. He didn't try to force the door. He didn't pull out a tool to shatter the glass. Instead, he slowly lowered his head until his face was inches from the glass. And then he raised his other hand and tapped a rhythm on the pane. Tap, 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 tap. It was a playful, mocking rhythm. He knew I was in there. He had seen me turn the kitchen lights off after the first knock. He wasn't checking to see if the house was empty. He was letting me know that he knew I was hiding in the dark. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I dialed 911, pressing the speaker to my ear. When the dispatcher answered, I whispered my address and told them there was a man at my back door. As I spoke, the man at the glass door stopped tapping. He slowly stood up straight, looked directly toward the living room sofa where I was hiding, and raised a single finger to where his lips would be under the hood in a shh motion. Then he turned around, vaulted our 6-foot wooden fence with terrifying agility, and vanished into the community woods. The police arrived 5 minutes later with their spotlights flashing, but the man was long gone. They found his handprint smeared on the sliding glass door and a set of deep footprints in the mud of our backyard. But what they told me next completely shattered my sense of security. They found a small, perfectly cut square piece of glass sitting on the patio table. He had a glass cutter in his pocket. He wasn't just there to look. If I hadn't been awake, if I hadn't been sitting in that kitchen when he first approached, he would have quietly removed the glass near the lock, reached in, and let himself inside while I slept upstairs. I never stay in that house alone anymore. And whenever I'm studying late at night and hear the house settle, I find myself staring at the windows, waiting for the sound of knuckles on the glass. That brings us to the end of tonight's descent into the dark. We like to believe that the walls of our homes are an impenetrable shield against the outside world, but as these stories prove, sometimes all it takes is a single knock to shatter that illusion entirely. If you have your own terrifying late-night encounter, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I might feature yours in an upcoming video. If you enjoyed these stories, please hit that like button and subscribe to Prince of Darkness with notifications turned on so you never miss a nightmare. Until next time, double-check your deadbolts and never answer the door in the dark. Good night.